Hello everybody and welcome back to Ancient Philosophy. In this lesson we're going to be talking about another one of the Pre-Socratic philosophers who's contributed some significance to the tradition of philosophy as it has developed. And we're going to talk about Parmenides. And it's quite fitting that we talk about Parmenides as almost a contrast to the philosopher from the previous lesson who was Heraclitus, because they did actually have some quite fundamentally contradictory beliefs when it came to the nature of metaphysics, for example. So that's what we're going to do in this lesson. We're going to unpack Parmenides as a philosopher, and we're going to talk about some of the most important contributions Parmenides has made to both philosophy and science. So, like I've mentioned already, in the last lesson we looked at the philosophy of Heraclitus, and we're going to explore the philosophy of Parmenides. And as I mentioned again, Parmenides represents a stark contrast to that of the philosophy that was presented by Heraclitus. So, according to Aristotle, Parmenides was either a student of Xenophanes, somebody who we've talked about already, either directly a student or at least a student of the teachings of Xenophanes. So there is a link in terms of the philosophical inquiry between these two different thinkers. He spent the majority of his life near the city of Naples, and this place was called Elea, and this is where he introduced a number of interesting philosophical inquiries during this time. And actually, he would be known for founding a little bit of a philosophical movement in this region, and we'll actually get on to the next lesson when we talk about Zeno, who is somebody who almost carried on the tradition of Parmenides' work. The vast majority of what we know about Parmenides, in terms of the primary sources and primary information and the fragments we understand to have about Parmenides, or directly written by Parmenides, comes from a poem which contains a number of philosophical thoughts and beliefs. And of this poem that we have, there is around 120 lines that still survive. And from these 120 lines, we can deduce a number of things related to his beliefs. But again, just like with other ancient philosophers during this time period, during this sort of pre-Socratic era, we don't know how much of what Parmenides believed was actually what he believed in fact, or what he was doing in terms of just writing poetically about a particular issue, because these philosophers wrote in quite ambiguous prose and quite poetic, using quite a poetic language. We note that there is a little bit of a distinction that can be made in terms of what we know for sure he believed and what he was writing about that can be taken to be a lot more ambiguous. But the poem itself, that is the 120 lines that survive, is split into two parts. The first is the, quote, path of truth, and the second is the path of mortal opinion. So we have here quite two relatively symbolic titles for the poems that he had written. And in terms of what we can take out and extract from these poems and look at to have an understanding of what he actually believed, Parmenides, one of the things that's the most important is the contribution to metaphysics, namely almost the introduction to the study of ontology, which is a very major aspect of metaphysics itself. Within this, as I will describe, very poorly written poem, definitely a very poorly written poem. I remember having to read it myself when I was studying ancient philosophy as an undergrad, and it was not particularly very fun to go through. So that set homework wasn't particularly great for me. Within this poem, we find Parmenides beginning a new philosophical tradition, and this is the philosophical tradition that we know today to be ontology. Parmenides is credited with the creation of the study of ontology, and we know, or we should know, for those who have taken a few basic philosophy classes or maybe gone through our lessons on metaphysics already, that ontology is the study and the philosophical study of being and becoming, the concept of what it means for something to exist in a particular way. The idea of being is heavily linked with the contrasting ideas that Parmenides has about flux. If you remember at the start of this lesson, I mentioned that Parmenides exists as almost a stark contrast in terms of philosophical beliefs to that of Heraclitus. And we know from the last lesson that Heraclitus was somebody who believed that the universe was in a constant state of flux. And we cited the very, very famous fragment, or the famous passage, that one does never step into the same river twice. The idea of this being that we are poetically representing the way in which you cannot step into the same river and for it to be the same, because the river is constantly flowing and it's constantly in flux. Unlike Heraclitus, Parmenides was not a believer that everything in the universe was in some kind of motion. In contrast, in fact, he was a philosopher who championed the idea that things were not in motion. He starkly disagreed with the beliefs of Heraclitus. And so how do these beliefs relating to whether or not things are in motion or things are not in motion, the idea of flux versus not being in flux, how do these things relate to Parmenides' beliefs in the concept of ontology, in the nature of being? Well, according to Parmenides, everything in the universe is what he describes as a being. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, the idea of being is a single unified concept. It is an idea that something is indivisible, having no experience of temporal change. If you are something that is a concept that is being, then you are not something that can be divided. You're not something that can experience temporal passage. Contrast this with, as I've mentioned, the ideas that were presented by Heraclitus. The idea that things can experience temporal passage, things that can be divisible. Everything is in motion. Water will boil, and the water is, when the water is leaving, the steam is being born almost. So we have an instance here where whatever happens, there is always something that is coming into and out of existence as a kind of constant notion of flux within the universe. Well, according to Parmenides, everything that changes in the universe will not change externally to this idea of being. So something might change. I don't think Parmenides would disagree that things in the universe will change, or things in the world around him will change. You can see that using your visible experiences, your visible perception. But what Parmenides believed, that anything that does change will change, but not because of a change in the nature of being. It will change externally to this ontological concept of being. Ultimately, this means that being is never changing. Even if things appear to have changed, they are in fact being, and they are the same. So, again, quite a complicated and quite difficult to explain in language, the concept of being within Parmenides' philosophy. And because obviously we use the word being in lots of different ways in modern terminology, in the modern lexicon of the English language. And so the concept of being as described by Parmenides is a little bit different to what we would describe as being if we were to describe that word colloquially. So a little bit of a difficult thing to deal with in that particular regard. When it comes to his scientific discoveries, just like with all the philosophers before, we can credit a number of different scientific discoveries to Parmenides. For Parmenides, his scientific discoveries are linked creatively with philosophical and mathematical notions of identity, which is quite interesting, okay? Because what he does is he makes scientific discoveries, but what's most important about these scientific discoveries isn't the fact that they are scientific discoveries, but the implication that these scientific discoveries will have on metaphysics and on mathematics in the future. So, for example, he was as a general side example, he was the first person in history, at least on paper, at least notably in history, to conclude that the Earth was a sphere. So we've known the Earth was a sphere at least as early as Parmenides. So that sort of dispels the common myth that people thought the Earth was flat all the way up to the Enlightenment, for example. This isn't true. We've known the Earth was round for a very long period of time. At least most people do. There are still some conspiracy theories today. So previously, thinkers and philosophers had all kinds of shapes in mind about what the Earth was said to be. For example, we had the ideas from previous philosophers that the Earth was cylindrical in nature, or that the Earth was infinite. That it would always go down to it would go down to infinity. You could never dig to the bottom of the earth, and so therefore the sun had to be new and come into existence every single day to try and explain this cycle. A second discovery, which is a lot more closely linked with these ideas relating to metaphysics, mathematics, and notions of identity, is that he concluded or deduced that the morning star and the evening star were both the same star, which is very, very interesting. You might not think that that is something that is quite, who really cares from a philosophical position, but it is interesting because a great amount of metaphysics relates to the concept of identity. It would start this new philosophical inquiry into the metaphysics of identity, the difference between numerical identity and the difference between quantitative identity and qualitative identity, all of these different things. And identity in logic as well is actually quite interesting when we think about how identity operates within, for example, first order logic or predicate logic, as we can sometimes describe it. These are things that, if you are somebody who's doing a philosophy degree or is going through the lessons on this channel, looking at different philosophical theories, you will notice and you will come to note that the metaphysics of identity is quite important. And it's almost as if Parmenides kick-started this belief or this sort of inquiry through his belief in a basic scientific discovery. So that's quite interesting. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about the philosopher Zeno. And Zeno has a lot more, is one of those philosophers that seems to have breached into the sort of common parlance in terms of the things that he presented in terms of his philosophy. I'm pretty sure most people who have never done philosophy or studied philosophy before would have a general idea about some of the thought experiments that Zeno had presented. And we will talk about each of those thought experiments in the next lesson.